A flash flood turns a narrow canyon into a roaring trap, leaving lone scout Elias Mercer without fire, food, or a way out. Every surge rises higher, every turn hides a new threat, and the walls close in with unforgiving force. With strength fading fast, his only chance is to read the canyon's patterns before they swallow him whole. In a place where one mistake means disappearance, survival becomes a battle of instinct against nature's most violent hour. Elias had walked the canyon before, but never under a sky so heavy and strange. Hours earlier, the world had seemed stable enough for a lone scout to travel on foot with nothing more than a bedroll, a knife, and a small pouch of dried beans he had planned to cook once he made camp. Yet the canyon's shape, a twisting spine of sandstone running north to south, made it a funnel for weather that originated far beyond his sight. Scouts in the frontier often traveled alone because speed mattered more than numbers, but solitude also meant relying fully on one's judgment. Elias had accepted that trade long ago, trusting his trained eye to read terrain the way others read maps. Now, as he stood knee-deep in a corridor of moving brown water, he realized the calm he'd known had been nothing but false shelter. The canyon around him tightened into bends no wider than 12 feet, framed by stone walls that rose between 30 and 60 feet. These walls, once painted softly by drifting afternoon light, had become towering slabs of darkness. Their smooth surfaces offered no handholds and no mercy. The rising flood pressed against the stone with a dull, relentless growl, its rhythm interrupted only by the clatter of tumbling branches and unseen rocks being dragged along the canyon floor. He could feel the air shift as wind rushed through the narrowing passage. The flood had formed miles upstream, born from a cloudburst he never saw. Frontier scouts often spoke of hidden storms, skyborne threats that visited their destruction miles away from where they formed. Elias remembered the warning given to young scouts by older hands. The most dangerous storm is the one you can't hear. Tonight, that warning had become painfully real. He pressed his hand to the canyon wall, feeling the cold film of water that slicked its surface. The wetness climbed at a visible pace, each minute stealing another inch of safe ground. He tried to judge the water rise rate the way he had been trained. He counted in silence, watching the wet line creep upward about half a foot each minute. That meant the canyon was filling faster than he could walk, and any hesitation might cost him the only chance to reach higher ground. The sound of the flood told its own brutal story. The rumble changed pitch when larger debris swept through, logs, branches, stones ranging from pebbles to chunks nearly the size of a saddlebag. His mentor once taught him debris speed could reveal flood strength. 10 miles per hour meant danger, 20 meant death. Judging by the blur of branches spinning past his legs and the vibration of the current against the rock, Elias guessed the surge pushed somewhere in that deadly range. The water was not yet chest high, but it was gaining on him quickly, an encroaching force that sought every low point in the canyon. A faint scent of disturbed sediment filled the air. The color of the water grew darker, muddy with fresh silt, another sign that upstream channels were breaking loose, releasing new waves of turbulence. Indigenous canyon travelers had understood these changes long before scouts like Elias walked these passages. Their careful observations of sediment color, wall wetness, and current behavior formed a deep body of knowledge. Elias had listened to those teachings with respect, and now they anchored his thinking. Every detail the canyon revealed had meaning. He scanned the walls for anything, any shelf, crack, or seam that could lift him above the flood's reach. The canyon, narrow as it was, showed little mercy in that regard. Most ledges were smooth undercuts that the rising water threatened to swallow. The sound of shifting gravel beneath the surface hinted at the current's strength. The flood scraped the canyon floor with a force that made the water feel alive and hungry. Elias stepped carefully, using small stones to test depth before shifting his weight forward. The water tugged at his legs, urging him toward deeper pockets. He ignored the pull, focusing instead on the textures beneath his feet. Scouts were trained to study surfaces before choosing a direction. Tonight, his survival depended on noticing the subtle vibrations in the stone, vibrations caused by hidden channels the flood had carved beneath the visible current. A sudden gust of wind pushed through the canyon, carrying with it a thin veil of suspended dust from the upper walls. Distant thunder rolled, muffled by the maze of stone. The sound did not come from overhead, it came from somewhere far off, another storm cell, or perhaps the lingering voice of the same storm that had fed the flood. The canyon collected voices like this, echoes that arrived stripped of origin. It was up to the listener to interpret them. The water surged against his boots, soaking the last dry fibers of his trousers. Elias shifted his stance and lifted his gaze, searching the wall again. That was when he saw the waterline climbing sharply toward a narrow shelf 5 feet above his head. It wasn't wide, barely enough room for a crouched man, but it was high enough to buy him time. The escape lines were few and cruel, but that ledge called to him like a final rope thrown to a drowning traveler. He studied the distance, calculating the angle he'd need to scale the slick stone. He knew the flood would continue rising at its steady pace, and hesitation would only reduce his window further. Every survival instinct he possessed told him that the ledge was his only immediate chance to stay above the violent current. But reaching it meant cutting across a section of the canyon floor that the flood had transformed into a rushing, debris-filled channel. The water there moved with frightening power, and one misstep could send him tumbling into the center of the surge. Still, the narrowing escape window left him no choice. As the canyon floor turned into a violent channel, Elias spotted one elevated ledge, but reaching it meant racing the flood. By dawn, the flood had reshaped everything. Pathways erased, shelves undercut, and the canyon transformed into a shifting maze. Elias stood amid cold spray, already weakened by his first fireless night. The water trapped him, but the walls offered clues the untrained eye would miss. Survival would hinge on interpreting stone as language. The first light of morning revealed the canyon's altered anatomy with unforgiving clarity. Vertical ribs of sandstone lined the passageway, each rib catching the rising water differently, creating small eddies and channels that hadn't existed the day before. The undercuts, deep hollows carved by centuries of seasonal currents, now trapped pockets of cold air that spilled outward like invisible winds, making the canyon feel 10 degrees colder than the open land above. Thin trails of drifting sediment floated just above the surface, moving with a rhythm that felt inconsistent at first glance. Elias recognized that nothing in this environment was random. The canyon was a system, and every movement hinted at a pattern beneath the surface. He scanned the narrow corridor ahead, noticing that the flood no longer pushed upward in a single relentless climb. Instead, it rose and paused in strange sequences, withdrawing slightly before surging forward again. These pulses came every few minutes, as if the canyon itself were breathing. Elias understood from prior training that such behavior meant upstream channels were discharging water unevenly. He watched the water recede by 2 or 3 inches, then rebound with greater force. Tracking these pulses would be crucial, because every interval offered a window in which the current weakened just enough to allow movement. At first, the shifting rhythm felt unpredictable, but Elias forced himself to watch long enough to identify how the flood behaved at different bends. The canyon's shape influenced everything, and the narrowest sections amplified the surges like a funnel forcing water into a confined throat. But the canyon's rhythms weren't the only threat. The cold creeping of dawn reminded Elias of the long night he had endured without fire. He had wedged himself into a shallow nook high enough to avoid the worst of the flood, but the stone behind him had been damp and unyielding. His wool clothing, soaked through from the earlier rise of water, clung heavily to his skin, robbing him of warmth faster than he could generate it. Temperature in the canyon had dropped to around 45 degrees, dangerous enough when drenched, and more so when coupled with wind gusts that easily reached 20 miles per hour. The wind swept down the canyon walls like a chilling blade, slicing through the narrow gaps and removing any sense of comfort. He hadn't slept so much as drifted between brief moments of dull exhaustion, each one broken by the rumble of passing debris or the shudder of the canyon reacting to another distant surge. Fire would have solved most of his problems. Heat to fend off the cold, smoke for signaling, boiling water for hydration, and light for reassurance. Without it, he had only his training. Frontier scouts learned how to conserve every shred of energy when the environment turned hostile. Elevation above direct airflow mattered. Dry pockets, rare as they were, offered enough shelter to slow heat loss. Curved rock faces could reflect body warmth back toward the occupant if positioned correctly. The key was minimizing exposure to wind while keeping the body's core insulated. Metabolic pacing became essential. Moving too much wasted precious calories, while staying too still allowed cold to steal heat from his limbs. Elias had chosen a position that balanced both extremes, pressing his back to a slightly concave slab of sandstone that helped trap what little warmth he generated. Now, with dawn upon him, Elias forced himself into clarity. This canyon was no longer simply a location, it was a moving system that needed to be read as one. Every sound and vibration meant something. The echo of rushing water changed tone with each incoming surge. The thin layer of sediment drifting across the surface pointed toward the deeper channels where turbulence gathered. Even the trapped pockets of cold air revealed narrow fractures higher in the wall, fractures that might offer escape if they could be reached. Scouts survived by noticing details others overlooked. They treated landscapes like conversations rather than obstacles, and Elias followed that discipline now, cataloging every sensation until the canyon's language became clearer. He stepped out from his small shelter as the newest pulse retreated slightly. The water was icy, swirling around his ankles with a faint pull that tested his balance. He watched the shifting sediment lines and realized they moved fastest near the inner curve of the upcoming bend. That meant the deeper channel was hugging the inside wall, leaving a shallower zone on the opposite side. He angled himself toward that shallow stretch, using the moment of reduced flow to reposition before the next surge. The canyon wind stung his cheeks, reminding him of the urgency of movement. Staying in one place assured nothing but worsening cold, and staying low meant the flood could still claim him if its next pulse rose higher than expected.
Elias pressed onward, mindful of every detail. The canyon's air carried the faint scent of wet minerals, the smell more distinct now that the sediment had been churned by the flood. The shifting light reflected off the slick stone walls, bouncing in unpredictable patterns that momentarily disoriented him. But through this disorientation came a deeper realization. The canyon operated on cycles, and those cycles were not arbitrary. If he could learn to anticipate them, he could navigate the terrain with precision rather than desperation. The water around him shivered as if warning of another pulse. Elias braced himself near a stone rib and observed closely. That was when he noticed a swirl pattern forming near the canyon's midpoint. It wasn't large, barely wider than a campfire ring, but it moved in a tight, deliberate rotation unlike the other turbulence around it. Swirls like that formed when underwater structures disturbed the flow, structures that could be either obstacles or opportunities. The swirl drew sediment downward, suggesting an uneven floor beneath the surface. A hollow? A submerged boulder? A hidden shelf? The realization tightened his breath. If the feature beneath that swirl offered elevation or shelter, it could change his entire route. If it masked a deeper drop, stepping toward it could end the story altogether. A strange swirl pattern in the current suggested the canyon floor hid a feature that could either save him or pull him under. By the end of the second day, hunger sharpened into weakness, and cold dulls the mind faster than hunger ever will. Yet Elias forced himself into the discipline every scout was trained for: pattern before panic, reading before acting. Knowledge was his only remaining tool. In a canyon where every mistake could become permanent, discipline mattered more than strength. Elias moved through the tight bend of the canyon with a deliberate slowness born not of caution alone, but of exhaustion settling deep into his muscles. He had not eaten in nearly 48 hours, and the absence of fuel inside his body created a strange hollow behind his ribs. His arms trembled in subtle waves, a sign that his body had begun burning through its final stores of energy.
Frontier scouts knew that after 72 hours without food, the body becomes an unreliable ally, with clarity of thought fading and impulsive decisions rising. In the canyon's cold corridors, where temperatures hovered in the mid-40s and wind gusts traveled like sharp needles, that weakness doubled. Shivering increased, but the shaking delivered less heat. His thoughts slowed, words forming sluggishly in his mind before dissolving into the canyon's rumble. Even so, Elias leaned into the training hammered into every capable scout. He knew he couldn't let the creeping fog in his mind take control. Scouts lived by a strict rhythm: observe, interpret, decide, adjust. The land never repeated itself exactly, and neither could a scout. His survival depended on observation cycles, brief windows in which he forced himself to absorb information from the environment. Every 30 seconds he scanned the canyon walls, then the water, then the ground beneath his feet. In colder terrain, scouts used hydration awareness as well, but in a flood trap like this, water wasn't the issue. It was the cold that threatened to steal his balance and awareness. The canyon floor had a subtle slope, barely noticeable unless someone studied its behavior across a long stretch. Elias understood that even a slight tilt of 5 to 9 degrees could influence how water pooled, receded, and surged. He leaned against a sandstone rib to steady himself, tracing the angle of the rock with chilled fingers. Tiny mineral grooves ran downward in soft arcs, carved by seasons of runoff. He angled his body in alignment with those grooves and watched how the thin film of water followed them. This confirmed the direction of the main current and revealed a section where the water thinned during each pulse. The pulse mattered more than anything else now. Elias timed them by breath, counting steadily. The water surged forward with a violent rush, swirling close to his knees, then retreated just slightly after a long pause. He noted the interval, roughly 14 minutes that time. The next pulse followed after 12. The third came after nearly 18. These irregularities were normal for a canyon fed by multiple channels, and Elias knew that tracking the average mattered more than recording every anomaly. Frontier scouts used the land's rhythm rather than resisting it, and he intended to do exactly that. If he could map the intervals, he would have small windows in which the water pressure weakened enough for him to move toward higher ground without being dragged under.
He applied a method learned years earlier. First, mark. He used a small line scratched into the stone with his knife when the water reached its highest point. Second, wait. He watched for the next highest surge and compared it with the line. Third, compare. He tracked the time between them. Fourth, confirm. He repeated the process enough times to verify the average interval. Fifth, adjust. He changed his position and timing accordingly. This simple 5-step sequence had saved countless scouts caught between rivers and cliffs. It wasn't designed for elegance, it was designed for survival. As he continued forward, Elias forced his mind to focus on terrain memory. Every bend, shelf, and crack he passed had to be stored in his head, because the canyon behind him looked nearly identical to the canyon ahead. He needed to remember where the stone dipped inward, where the undercuts held still air, and where debris collected during surges. Hunger tried repeatedly to push aside his concentration, making his vision blur around the edges, but he refused to give in. He rehearsed each detail silently, anchoring them in his thoughts. Scouts lived by recollection. Losing track of the canyon's layout meant losing the path to escape. He paused near a narrow point where the canyon walls pinched together, no more than 8 feet apart. The water swept through this constriction with greater force, but the rock on the opposite side curved upward slightly, revealing a path that might offer safer footing during the next pulse. To confirm his suspicion, Elias studied the water's behavior. The flood pressed inward, then slid along the inner wall before losing some of its energy at a small indentation barely visible from where he stood. That indentation meant less turbulence. Less turbulence meant stability. The pulse built again, telegraphed by a faint shudder beneath his boots. The sound of tumbling sediment approached, and the thin lines of silt floating near the surface elongated like drawn threads. Elias braced himself, gripping a protruding stone with numb fingers. The water rose, surged around him, and receded. He counted carefully, marking the rhythm. 16 minutes had passed since the last major pulse. The average was beginning to show itself, somewhere between 12 and 18 minutes. That gave him only narrow windows, but windows nonetheless. Cold gnawed at him, making his muscles feel as though they belonged to someone else. He breathed steadily and searched ahead, trying to decide his next move. The canyon twisted again, and the morning light filtered down in uneven shafts that flickered against the wet stone. In the shifting reflections, something caught his attention, a thin stone vein running diagonally upward along the canyon wall. It wasn't wide enough to walk, but perhaps wide enough to grip if he could reach it. The vein looked like a natural ladder carved by centuries of runoff. If he could gain that height, he might escape the flood's strongest pull. As another calm pulse settled around his ankles, Elias realized the vein might be his only path upward. The decision would be risky, but risks were meaningless compared to being trapped when the next surge arrived. He studied the angle and distance, judging whether the climb was possible in his weakened state. The stone beckoned like a secret route waiting to be tested. During a calm pulse, Elias saw a narrow stone vein leading upward, just high enough to tempt a risky climb. The water quieted for barely a minute, just long enough for Elias to test the stone. It was wet, angled, and coated with grit, a combination that destroys footing. But higher ground meant warmth, perspective, and a chance to see beyond the flooded doom below. He knew the canyon would not offer many opportunities like this, and hesitation would only tighten its hold.
Elias stepped toward the stone vein, studying its shape with the precision of someone who had spent most of his life reading landscapes rather than maps. The vein ran diagonally across the canyon wall like a pale ribbon carved through darker sandstone. It rose 15 feet above the surge line, forming a narrow path no wider than a man's palm. The surface glistened under thin morning light, slick from spray and sediment. Climbing such a feature demanded calculation, not force. He needed to preserve what little strength he had left, especially after 2 days without food. But he also understood that the canyon offered no safe resting place. Remaining on the floor meant gambling with the next unpredictable surge. Scouts were taught early the value of 3-point contact, keeping 2 hands and 1 foot or 2 feet and 1 hand anchored at all times. It allowed the climber to maintain balance even when the stone betrayed them. Elias placed 1 hand against the wall, feeling along the grain for patches that seemed less slippery. The trick to wet rock climbing wasn't about brute gripping, it was about finding small textures that offered enough friction for directional pressure. A slight ridge could make the difference between a stable ascent and a disastrous slip. Elias brushed his fingers across the sandstone until they found a faint rise no wider than an inch. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He shifted his weight carefully, lifting 1 foot to a notch that appeared barely deep enough to accept it. Wet rock reduced friction dramatically, and he tested the placement multiple times before committing. The canyon wind swept upward along the walls, chilling his damp clothing and making the climb feel even more precarious. The gusts did not push with violent force, but they carried the kind of unpredictable movement that unsettled balance. Elias steadied himself, narrowed his breath, and began applying the method he had learned for situations exactly like this one. Angle reading came first. He studied the direction of the rock's slope, identifying where the vein tilted inward just enough to offer a safer weight shift. Then he distributed his force diagonally rather than straight downward, pressing his boots into the stone with gradual tension rather than abrupt steps. Friction testing followed with each new handhold. He applied slight pressure to ensure the grip held before committing his weight. Finally, he searched constantly for ledges, even the smallest protrusion, because each allowed a brief moment of rest. Those rests would be crucial. Every second he could pause without losing stability gave him a chance to recover and evaluate the wall above. The stone veined upward in an irregular pattern, which helped him more than he expected. Frontier teachings often included references to indigenous rock shelf knowledge, lessons passed down from canyon-dwelling peoples who understood natural stone features intimately. They knew that lines in sandstone rarely formed randomly. Each followed the pathway of ancient water or the fracture of deeper layers long eroded away. Elias remembered those teachings as he climbed, aware that this vein likely served as evidence of slow-cutting water from centuries past. It gave him confidence that the formation might hold steady under his weight.
The first 5 feet came slowly, each movement cautious, measured. His muscles trembled, not from fear, but from the cold digging deeper into his bones. Hunger made his limbs feel both heavy and hollow at once. The canyon's constant spray coated the stone in a thin, shimmering sheen that forced him to keep each shift of weight deliberate. Halfway up, he paused at a small indentation barely wide enough to nestle part of his boot. It offered a precarious but necessary break. He pressed his shoulder gently against the wall, anchoring himself while he caught a few precious breaths. The sound of water below surged again as another pulse arrived, rushing through the canyon floor with a roar that reminded him how narrow the margin of safety truly was. When the pulse receded, Elias resumed climbing, pressing his fingertips into a narrow seam that ran along the top portion of the vein. The seam measured perhaps 1 or 2 inches deep, small, but it allowed him to hook his fingers enough to maintain stability. He pulled upward using a combination of arm and torso movement, shifting his weight to a new foothold. The sandstone vibrated faintly from the current below, but the rock itself felt solid. He kept climbing, focusing on movement rather than imagining the drop beneath him. By the time he reached the final stretch, the gap between him and the vein's upper point narrowed. The angle steepened slightly, forcing him to lean closer into the stone. His legs strained with effort, and his hands felt stiff from cold and abrasion, but he knew he was close. Another small indentation, barely noticeable, became his final stepping point. He steadied his grip, exhaled, and lifted himself onto the ledge above. The ledge was barely wide enough for him to crouch, but it offered safety beyond anything the canyon floor could provide. From this vantage point, he saw the canyon differently. The elevated view revealed how the walls curved ahead, creating a labyrinth of shadows and narrow passages hidden from the ground. The stone rose and fell in unpredictable angles, and the water's behavior changed as it funneled through the canyon's curves. The entire landscape felt transformed now that he saw it from above rather than within its grip. He took a moment to observe the current below, the twist around a bend not far downstream creating a distortion unlike any he had noticed before. The turbulence didn't match the typical flood pattern. Instead of flowing smoothly through the constriction, the water surged violently, then dipped with a hesitation that seemed unnatural. Something beneath the surface was redirecting the current, forcing it into abrupt motions. Elias narrowed his focus, watching how sediment moved around the disturbance. It collected in a swirling pattern before dropping suddenly into a vortex that vanished almost instantly. That behavior told him the canyon floor hid something, an obstacle, a deep pocket, or a structure shaped by ancient erosion. Whatever it was, it influenced the flood in ways that could change the entire route ahead. The sight sent a slow ripple of recognition through him. Features like that often concealed hidden shelves or alternate pathways that only became visible from higher ground, and opportunities like those were rare. If he could reach that strange choke point safely, it might lead him to a new route out of the water's worst reach. Elias spotted a choke point downstream where the water behaved unnaturally. A low ripple of recognition through him. Features like that often concealed hidden shelves or alternate pathways that only became visible from higher ground, and opportunities like those were rare. If he could reach that strange choke point safely, it might lead him to a new route out of the water's worst reach. Elias spotted a choke point downstream where the water behaved unnaturally.
Below him, the canyon narrowed into a crooked stone throat where water twisted as if hitting an unseen barrier. Only an experienced scout would notice the meaning behind that distortion. Elias had found both danger and opportunity. The canyon was speaking through its current, and every swirl, dip, and vibration carried information waiting to be read. From his elevated ledge, Elias studied the choke point with a concentration sharpened by necessity. The canyon walls pinched inward sharply, narrowing the passage to no more than 6 or 7 feet. In places like this, water never behaved calmly. When a flood was forced through a constriction, it accelerated, then swirled violently as it broke free on the other side. The twisting water below displayed exactly that pattern. First a hard push, then a tight spin that made the sediment dance in circular formations. But this spin didn't match the usual rhythm of a standard constriction. It repeated in a more organized circle, closing and reopening in a predictable loop, as if something beneath the surface directed the current with deliberate influence. Elias watched closely, recognizing the telltale signs of a submerged boulder. Large rocks often became lodged permanently in canyon floors, their positions adjusted only slightly by extreme floods. When water struck them at high speed, 8 to 12 miles per hour in this case, it split around the stone's body before rejoining on the downstream side. This rejoining caused a turbulence radius that usually stretched between 4 and 7 feet, depending on depth and velocity. Elias measured the distance visually, noting the whirlpool's rotation and collapse more than once to confirm his assumptions. The disturbance fit the pattern perfectly. Something immovable shaped the water's path. Frontier scouts learned early to read turbulence as if it were a footprint. A footprint showed shape, pressure, and direction. Turbulence showed the same on a fluid canvas. Elias approached it with that mindset, knowing the water spoke through its movements. The direction of the initial acceleration revealed where the water struck the obstruction. The bubble spread showed how deep the object lay. The rotational axis demonstrated the shape of the obstruction. Rounded stones created smooth circles. Jagged ones produced irregular spirals. The rebound pattern, where the water rejoined and lifted slightly before settling again, showed where the channel narrowed or opened. These readings allowed a skilled scout to map the underwater landscape without ever touching it. Elias applied each step methodically. First, he traced direction. The flow angled inward toward a point slightly left of center, confirming the obstruction sat closer to the left wall. Second, he evaluated bubble spread. The froth rose in uneven clusters that flattened quickly, meaning the object was not too deep, likely only a foot or two below the surface. Third, he studied the rotational axis, watching how the current looped in a counterclockwise motion before collapsing. That motion was smooth and consistent, suggesting the obstruction had rounded edges rather than sharp ones. Fourth, he assessed the rebound pattern. The current lifted slightly after clearing the obstacle, forming a brief upward swell before settling again. This meant the canyon floor dipped behind the obstruction, potentially forming a pocket or shelf. The fifth step, confirming the pattern, required time, and Elias took it. He watched the turbulence cycle through its sequence 3 times, each confirming what he suspected. The pattern signaled a hidden shelf just past the boulder. Such shelves often formed when floods carved a deeper notch behind an obstacle. They could offer a temporary refuge, just large enough for a man to stand or crouch without being fully exposed to the current. In a canyon where every inch mattered, that shelf could become a stepping stone in his escape.
But reaching it wouldn't be simple. He saw the difficulty immediately. The shelf lay downstream, near the center of the choke point, and he remained perched on a ledge above and slightly upstream. The only way to reach the shelf was to descend again and time his approach perfectly between pulses. The water surged unpredictably, each new interval carrying different debris and different force. A mist of cold spray rose from the turbulence, drifting up to where Elias crouched, chilling his skin further. The idea of re-entering the water, after so many hours of cold and hunger, sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with temperature. Yet he also recognized that staying where he was offered no solution. The ledge provided temporary safety, but not escape. From his new vantage point, the canyon opened into a larger basin beyond the choke point, offering what looked like a gentler slope on the far side. If he could reach the hidden shelf, then move beyond it during the next pulse, he might be able to step onto the basin's edge and find a safer path upward. The canyon wasn't offering a clear route, but it was offering hints, subtle signals woven into the water's patterns. Elias shifted his position to study the angle he would need to descend. The climb down would mirror the ascent he had just completed, except now he would be working against gravity, with stones still slick beneath his hands. The rising mist from the choke point made the surface more treacherous by the minute, and the water below seemed to sense his hesitation,
surging and swirling with an almost taunting rhythm. Elias took a slow breath, steadying his mind. Panic had no place here. The canyon demanded awareness, not fear. He reviewed his plan with the quiet clarity of someone who had survived challenges by relying on method rather than hope. He would descend during the next retreating pulse, moving quickly but with deliberate footing. Once on the canyon floor, he would angle toward the outer edge of the turbulence. He needed to avoid the central whirl where the rotation could destabilize him. The approach required precise timing. Too early, and he would be caught in the surge. Too late, and the current would reclaim its strength before he reached the safe pocket. He pressed his palm against the rock face, feeling the stone's faint vibration as another pulse built upstream. The tension in the air thickened, carrying the sound of rolling rocks tumbling within the unseen channels. Elias traced the movement of the water with his eyes, memorizing the cycle once more. He understood what awaited him below. The shelf might save him, or it might prove too narrow, forcing him into deeper danger. But the canyon offered no second choices, no alternate doors. Scouts lived in the space between action and consequence, and he had reached the moment where action was no longer optional. He adjusted his stance, testing the foothold that would begin his descent. The canyon floor churned beneath him, waiting for him to commit. Every instinct warned him of the risk, but every bit of training pushed him forward. The turbulence whispered of possibility. Dangerous, yes, but necessary. To reach the hidden shelf, Elias would have to descend again, right into the flood's dangerous timing window.
Returning to the canyon floor meant entering the water's domain again. Elias felt the cold bite against his skin, reminding him how little strength remained. 3 days of hunger had carved away more than muscle. Now decision-making itself became a battlefield. Even breathing required focus, because cold water could steal clarity faster than fear ever could. Elias positioned himself at the edge of the ledge, where the stone vein he had climbed now demanded a careful descent. Going down was always harder than going up, especially with wet rock threatening to turn every foothold into a slip. The canyon's pulse had become familiar enough for him to sense its rhythm without staring at the water. The brief retreat after each surge gave him roughly 60 to 90 seconds to move without being overwhelmed. He waited, crouched low, listening for the distant shift in tone that signaled the pulse was weakening. When the roar softened into a rolling hum, he began his descent. His fingers gripped the narrow seam along the stone, and he eased his way downward with slow, controlled movements. Wet grit pressed beneath his boots, threatening to shift with every step. The canyon wall radiated cold through the thin layer of his damp trousers, and each contact point felt like touching chilled iron. The wind funneled through the canyon in sharp bursts, adding another challenge by pushing against his balance. Still, he moved with the steady discipline of a trained scout, lowering himself inch by inch until his boots hovered just above the rising water. The moment his foot entered the current, cold water shock hit him like a silent blow. Water between 45 and 55 degrees wrapped around his leg, triggering an involuntary gasp he barely managed to suppress. Cold water shock had claimed many travelers by forcing sudden breaths that swallowed water instead of air. Elias locked his jaw and focused on maintaining a slow, controlled inhale. Breath control mattered more now than physical strength. Panic would shorten his window of action, and he had none to spare. He immersed his second foot, feeling the pull of the current tighten around his ankles. The water's turbulence was far stronger than it looked from above. It tugged at his legs with a relentless grip, urging him toward deeper channels. Elias leaned into the rock, letting his body adjust to the chill so he could follow the survival method drilled into him during training. The first step was pulse timing, moving only when the flood withdrew into its temporary lull. He counted the seconds, reassuring himself that he still understood the rhythm. Next came angle control. He needed to enter the current at a slight diagonal rather than head-on, allowing water to brush past him instead of slamming into his chest. Once he took 2 steps into the water, the third step required establishing contact, using his free hand to maintain a point of balance against the stone. With each shift forward, he tested the rock ahead, ensuring it wouldn't break loose under pressure. The fourth step was counterforce, pressing outward with his legs to offset the current's inward pull.
This allowed him to stay aligned and avoid being twisted sideways, where turbulence could sweep him off his feet. The water reached his knees as he pushed forward, moving with a slow, methodical rhythm. The current vibrated with energy from the choke point downstream, and debris occasionally brushed against his legs, reminding him of the hidden dangers beneath the surface. Fallen twigs, dirt clumps, and fragments of root drifted through the water, each carried by a force he could feel more than see. Frontier scouts had long known that crossing a flooded basin required both patience and nerve. A hasty step could turn a manageable current into a trap. Elias respected that knowledge, allowing it to guide him as he moved closer to the swirling turbulence. When the next pulse approached, the water surged higher, slapping against his thighs with renewed strength. Elias gripped a stone rib jutting from the wall, pressing his shoulder against it to steady himself. The canyon rumbled as rocks tumbled somewhere upstream, carried by the accelerating force of the flood. He waited, letting the pulse pass, conserving strength for the next interval. Hunger gnawed at him sharply, draining what little warmth his body managed to generate. He could feel the hollow weakness deepening, but he refused to let it dictate his choices. His mind needed to stay ahead of the canyon's movements. As the water receded again, Elias advanced, following the path he'd chosen, just inside the calmer edge of the turbulence. The choke point's swirl grew louder, and the motion of the current became more chaotic. Sediment spun in a dizzying arc, cascading around the submerged boulder he had identified from above. The swirl pulled at him as he stepped closer, trying to draw him inward. Elias shifted his weight outward, leaning into the canyon wall with deliberate pressure. He angled himself to avoid the circular draw, bracing with each step until his hand slid across a deeper crevice in the stone.
That crevice marked the location of the narrow stone crack he had seen forming at the edge of the turbulence. Up close, it appeared almost invisible, a tight slit formed by erosion or perhaps the collapse of a much older shelf. Water rushed past its opening, flowing too quickly for him to see what lay inside. Elias studied the crack, searching for any sign that it might lead to a safer pocket. The water's behavior revealed a subtle but important clue. The current near the crack pulled inward, but not downward. This meant water entered the crack only to flow along its length, rather than dropping into a hidden pit. More importantly, the crack produced a faint echo, a sound of empty space hidden behind its narrow opening. That hollow tone could only mean one thing. A pocket of dry elevation existed inside. His pulse quickened as he positioned himself to enter the crack. The challenge required precise timing. The surge surged again, climbing nearly to his waist, and he pressed himself against the wall, letting the canyon's cold breath wash over him. He felt the tremor underfoot signaling that the pulse was peaking. As it began to recede, Elias seized the moment. He angled his body sideways, slipping into the crack with a swift movement, using the narrowing walls as leverage. The stone pressed tightly against his shoulders as he inched upward, the water brushing his legs but failing to drag him back out. The crack widened slightly after several feet, revealing a dry, elevated slot carved into the canyon's interior. Elias pulled himself inside, collapsing against a pocket of stone untouched by the flood. The sudden relief of dry ground felt surreal after hours of battling the cold. He rested his palm on the stone, breathing heavily as his body adjusted to the shift in temperature and effort. Inside the crack, Elias discovered a dry, elevated slot, proof the canyon hid a navigable spine. Sheltered from the main current, Elias found himself in a narrow stone corridor carved by centuries of erosion. Few would ever see it, and fewer still would recognize it for what it was, a concealed staircase nature built for those who understood her language. The air inside carried the cool stillness of hidden spaces untouched by the chaos below, and for the first time in hours, Elias felt the canyon offer something other than threat. It offered direction. The corridor stretched only 2 to 4 feet wide, a cramped passage pressed between ancient stone layers. Yet its narrowness created safety. The deeper he moved into it, the less he felt the tremors of flooded water. The stone absorbed the vibrations, leaving only a faint hum that sounded distant compared to the roaring current he had just escaped. The walls bore jagged textures, carved by slow, patient erosion rather than sudden floods.
These ridges formed natural shelves, small ledges spaced roughly 1 or 2 feet apart, staggered like uneven steps. Some shelves were smooth and slanted, others rough and brittle, but all hinted at the possibility of upward travel. He pressed his palm against one of the shelves. It felt dry, warm compared to the chill of the canyon floor, as if the stone here had been shielded long enough to retain the heat gathered earlier in the day. These dry pockets mattered. They offered places to brace his weight without the constant fear of slipping. They also meant this corridor rarely flooded fully, confirming that it acted as a spine above the main water channel. Elias had heard stories of such features, narrow internal paths that ran parallel to canyon floors used by indigenous travelers long before frontier scouts walked these landscapes. Those stories described hidden routes carved by time, accessible only to those who could read the layers of stone with respect. In his youth, an older scout once spoke of them as if they were mythical. According to him, canyon spines formed where weaker stone layers eroded more quickly, creating vertical seams that could be followed like ladders. These seams offered escape when the canyon floor became impassable. Elias never imagined he would depend on such a feature for survival, but the memory grounded him now. It reminded him that others had faced similar trials and prevailed by trusting the land rather than fighting it. The corridor climbed steadily upward, angled just enough to show purpose, but steep enough to demand attention. Elias paused to study the slope. Hunger and cold weighed heavily on him, creating a dull ache that radiated through his limbs. But he knew that staying still would be a mistake. The canyon below remained unpredictable, and the spine might be his only chance to gain enough height before the next surge arrived. The air in the corridor shifted gently, hinting at an opening somewhere ahead, a subtle promise that if he continued, the path might lead him closer to the rim. He prepared himself for the ascent by revisiting the survival method that governed his movements whenever climbing natural stone. The first step was posture, keeping his center of gravity low and close to the wall so the uneven shelves could support him without throwing him off balance. Next came testing the stone. Before committing any weight, he tapped each ledge with his knuckles, listening for hollow echoes that signaled weak spots. Solid stone gave a firm thud. Fragile stone whispered a dull, unreliable sound. Once he confirmed the stability, he placed his foot with gentle pressure, gradually increasing force until the ledge accepted his weight. Friction mattered too. Dry stone provided far better grip than wet stone, but even wet surfaces could be deceptive. Elias brushed loose dust away with his fingers, using the moisture on his skin to improve traction. Then he moved slowly, alternating hands and feet with careful precision. Scouts had a simple rule for climbing natural spines: always leave yourself a way back. This meant never stepping so far that retreat became impossible. Elias respected the rule now more than ever, using each new shelf as a checkpoint rather than rushing upward blindly. As he climbed, the corridor revealed more details. Some shelves were carved by ancient trickles of water, narrow but dependable. Others were shaped by frost fractures, sharp and angled but firm. Every ledge became a moment of negotiation, a quiet conversation between weight and stone. The air grew slightly warmer as he ascended, the canyon walls absorbing sunlight from somewhere above. That warmth offered a brief comfort to his chilled body, a reminder that the outside world still existed beyond the canyon's tightening grip. He paused when he reached a wider pocket, a natural alcove large enough for him to crouch. The pocket provided a moment to rest, and Elias used it to gather his thoughts. The climb demanded energy his starved body struggled to provide, but he refused to let fatigue cloud his judgment. He forced himself to memorize the corridor's shape, noting each fork and curvature. The spine twisted like a serpent, doubling back on itself before continuing upward. A lesser scout might have mistaken it for a dead end, but Elias recognized the subtle tilt of the shelves leading higher. He pressed onward, guided by a growing shift in the quality of the light. The corridor brightened slightly, suggesting an opening ahead. As he followed the twist, the stone under his hand felt warmer, and the faint smell of dry air suggested he was nearing a vent or fracture that connected to the world outside. His heartbeat quickened, not from panic, but from the fragile hope that he might be approaching a vantage point high enough to see a new escape route. Yet something in the atmosphere changed.
The warmth seemed to fade as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a stillness that made the corridor feel tense. Elias listened carefully. The canyon had been humming softly beneath him, but now the vibrations grew stronger. The stone under his feet tremored with renewed intensity, sending a subtle shake up his legs. A shift in pressure filled the narrow passageway, as if the canyon inhaled sharply. Then came the sound, a deep rumble, rolling through the rock like distant thunder. It wasn't the echo of falling debris or the normal reverberation of the canyon. It carried a heavier weight, a warning drawn from miles upstream. Elias recognized it instantly. It was the unmistakable signal of a new surge forming in the upper channels, larger and more forceful than the earlier ones. A fresh rumble upstream warned that another surge was coming. The canyon trembled with a low growl, the sign of an incoming surge racing down the drainage channel. Elias only had minutes, perhaps less, to climb high enough that the new wave would not tear him free. Survival no longer rested on patience or observation. It rested on speed, precision, and the last fragments of strength he still possessed. The canyon had shifted from teacher to pursuer, and Elias had no choice but to outrun the lesson it carried. He braced himself against the walls of the hidden spine, feeling the vibrations intensify beneath his boots. The surge wasn't subtle. It moved like a giant body rushing through distant veins of stone, gathering momentum as it fed on newly released upstream water. Rainfall in far-off elevations, rain that Elias had never seen, now pushed through tributaries and narrow channels, converging into a single violent force. Frontier scouts knew this phenomenon too well. Distant storms often unleashed delayed bursts of water that arrived without warning, catching travelers in situations they never anticipated. Now the canyon was preparing to deliver one of those bursts. Elias looked upward, calculating the distance to the next shelf. The spine's structure twisted and fractured as it neared the canyon rim, becoming less like a staircase and more like a tangled series of broken ledges. If he climbed fast enough, he might reach a safe height before the surge struck, but his body felt dangerously depleted. Hunger had drained him, turning simple motions into labored actions. Cold had stiffened his joints, and every breath burned with a shallow ache. He had maybe 3 minutes, possibly less, before the incoming water would surge 2 to 4 feet higher than the last one. If he stayed where he was, even inside the spine, the rising force could infiltrate the narrow passage and sweep him out. He pressed onward, relying on the survival method he had learned for rapid vertical ascents. The first requirement was to stabilize breathing. A panicked rhythm would weaken grip and impair judgment, so he forced each inhale to slow, even as urgency clawed at his thoughts. Next, he scanned for anchor points, solid protrusions or shelves capable of supporting quick weight shifts. He memorized their positions in a single sweep, creating a mental sequence. Third came commitment. In fast climbs, hesitation could be fatal. The climber needed to trust each hold without revisiting doubt. The fourth requirement was angle control, keeping the torso close to the wall to reduce backward drag if the surge reached him mid-climb. Lastly, he had to anticipate stone shifts, testing for stability mid-motion, not before, to save precious seconds. He launched upward using the method with a fluid determination that surprised him. His boots caught the first ledge not quite cleanly, but firmly enough for him to shift weight upward. The stone scraped against his palms, leaving thin burns where the grit dug into skin already raw from earlier climbs. The corridor narrowed briefly, forcing him sideways as he climbed, squeezing through a seam no wider than his shoulders. He could feel the canyon tightening its grip, as if testing his resolve. Below him, the low growl deepened into a rolling, thunderous surge that pulsed through the stone like a living heartbeat. The sound pushed him faster. He climbed upward, reaching for a shelf that slanted sharply upward. The shelf was dry, which helped, but angled enough that he had to use both legs to push against it. His muscles trembled under the strain. He paused for a single moment, gathering strength, unable to ignore how light-headed he had become. Hunger clouded his vision with a faint blur, forcing him to blink repeatedly as he refocused. The canyon's light above flickered, shifting between pale gold and shadow as clouds drifted across the unseen sky.
That flicker reminded him that he was close, close enough to smell the faint dryness of open air drifting downward. A sudden tremor made him look down. The water surged through the lower sections of the canyon, its roar magnified by the tight passages below. The sound reached him with startling speed. He couldn't see it yet, but he could sense its force approaching, swelling upward like a storm made of liquid stone. Time collapsed into urgency. Elias pushed himself upward, ignoring the tremor in his arms. His fingers closed around a jagged protrusion, and he used it to haul himself up another 4 feet. Each motion felt heavier, as if his limbs carried weights tied to them. His breath shortened, and a cold pressure formed in his chest, warning him of the limits of his endurance.
The spine widened suddenly, opening into a fractured chamber where multiple ledges branched out like unfinished stairways. This terrain was less stable. The stone here had endured centuries of freeze-thaw cycles, creating weak points hidden beneath a crust of seemingly solid rock. Elias chose the path that angled slightly right, trusting the subtle tilt of stone that suggested greatest stability. He moved quickly, tapping each shelf only once with his boot before shifting weight. There was no time for thorough testing. He relied on instinct sharpened by years of traveling rugged landscapes. As he climbed higher, the spine's interior opened slightly, revealing glimpses of the canyon's main walls through thin fractures. Sunlight filtered through these gaps, illuminating particles of dust that swirled lazily despite the chaos below. Elias reached upward and found a ledge formed by a fractured stone plate. It sloped outward, making it a challenging foothold, but it lifted him closer to the rim. He positioned one foot on the plate and pushed, feeling the stone groan under his weight. It held, for now. The growl beneath him shifted abruptly into a full-throated roar. The surge had entered the lower spine. Water smashed against the base of the corridor, sending vibrations that rattled the stone beneath his boots. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He pushed onward, climbing with a speed driven by instinct rather than strength. His hands reached another ledge, rough and partially broken, jutting out like a cracked rib from the canyon wall. He gripped it tightly, pulling himself upward, while the rush of water surged closer, echoing so loudly that the entire spine felt alive with movement. The fractured terrain above shifted again, revealing a narrow exit that opened toward a higher ridge. Elias pushed himself upward, his heart pounding fiercely, knowing the margin between escape and disaster had narrowed to mere seconds. The ledge ahead looked sturdy enough to support him, and he reached for it with desperate determination. But as his fingers tightened around its edge, the stone beneath his hand shifted, cracking under the sudden pressure. A fragment broke free, tumbling down the spine and disappearing into the darkness below. Just as Elias reached a fractured ledge, a piece crumbled under his hand. With the surge roaring beneath him and the stone failing above him, Elias balanced on the thinnest margin of survival. One wrong move meant being swept into the canyon's crushing throat. But he had one last calculation left. Everything he had endured, cold, hunger, exhaustion, now funneled into this single push toward freedom. The fractured ledge he clung to trembled under his weight, shedding small flakes of sandstone that tumbled into the darkness below. The structure stretched 10 to 12 feet across, slanted at a punishing angle of nearly 40 degrees. It served as the final barrier between Elias and the upper rim, but its instability made it more of a trap than a guarantee. Wind skimmed across its surface, sweeping loose grit into sudden gusts that stung his face and threatened to unsettle his fragile balance. The ledge leaned outward just enough to make every step a negotiation between gravity and intention. He drew a steady breath, forcing his mind to focus through the fatigue fogging his thoughts. The surge below erupted into a deeper roar, slamming against the walls of the spine with enough force to shake dust loose from the ceiling. The climbing corridor he had used moments earlier was now fully swallowed by rushing water. Elias knew he had barely escaped. He would not get another opportunity like this. The only way out was over the ledge, if it held. The first challenge was weight distribution. The stone beneath him bore cracks that spread like veins, branching in unpredictable directions. Some sections appeared compressed and solid, others bore the faint curve of erosion beneath their surface. Frontier scouts relied on stone-reading tactics in moments like this, studying the slight shifts in color, light reflection, and texture to understand where the rock held strength and where it disguised weakness. Elias pressed his fingertips gently across the ledge, feeling for temperature differences, a subtle but reliable indicator. Stones weakened by moisture tended to feel colder, while stronger sections retained more warmth.
The uneven warmth across the ledge gave him a rough map of safe zones and dangerous ones. He crouched close to the stone to lower his center of gravity and began the slow inspection required before committing to any movement. Testing compromised rock demanded a specific method. First, knock lightly with knuckles to listen for hollow tones. Then, apply gentle pressure with the heel of the hand to check surface stability. Next, observe microfractures running in parallel lines, which often indicated structural stress. After that, place partial weight on the chosen point while maintaining alternate support. And finally, commit only when the stone showed no signs of shifting under incremental pressure. Elias had relied on this process during countless frontier travels, but rarely under conditions as dire as these. He knocked on a section of the ledge, listening for a dull echo, sure sign of fragility. It reverberated weakly, confirming this segment could not hold him. He shifted right and tested again. This time the stone responded with a solid, satisfying thud. He pushed gently with his palm. The ledge held. He noted a faint upward curve in the structure, which often indicated resistance to downward stress. That would be his first anchor point. With cautious movements, Elias stepped on the identified zone. His foot pressed into the rough texture, and the stone held steady. He shifted his weight gradually, testing its reliability. The ledge creaked, but did not give way. Encouraged, he eased into a slow ascent, using his hands and knees to distribute his body weight more evenly. His boots scraped across the gritty surface, leaving faint trails in the dust. The wind intensified, tugging at his clothing, urging him backward. He resisted the impulse to lean away from the wall. Instead, he pressed closer, trusting the rock more than the air behind him. He moved along the ledge, choosing each step with meticulous attention. Twice he paused to test new contact points, tapping the stone, listening, reading the subtle vibrations. His body trembled from exertion, his arms burning with fatigue that settled deep into the muscles. Hunger flared like a distant ache, trying to claw at his concentration. The cold had become a constant companion, no longer sharp, just draining. But he kept moving, pushing himself past the limits he once imagined immovable.
The stone shifted beneath him just once, a small tremor that stopped his breath. A loose fragment cracked off under the pressure of his step and fell. He heard it hit the surge below with a faint splash, swallowed instantly by roaring water. Elias froze, his palm pressed tightly against a more stable portion of the ledge. He waited, letting the stones settle. The canyon around him felt alive, as if observing his struggle with silent judgment. When the vibration stopped, he continued, more cautiously than before. As he neared the upper edge of the ledge, the terrain shifted again. The fractured surface transitioned into a series of smaller, firmer outcrops, a promising sign that he was nearing the rim's support zone. The cracks thinned into lines that ran horizontally rather than vertically, suggesting the rock here bore less stress from the canyon's previous floods. This section held potential. Elias angled himself toward it, gripping a jagged protrusion that jutted from the wall like the handle of a concealed door. He pulled himself upward, using the last reservoir of strength hidden somewhere beneath exhaustion. His boots scraped loudly, scattering small stones that rattled down the slope. His breath emerged in uneven bursts, each inhale a reminder that his endurance teetered on the edge. The wind struck him again, colder now as it funneled across the exposed face of the canyon. But this wind carried something else, fresh air, unfiltered by the canyon's depths. It whispered of open sky. Just a few more feet. He could see the faint glow of daylight brushing across the upper stones, painting them in pale gold. The rim was close, too close to fail now. He dug his fingers into a final crack, gripping tightly as he pushed upward with every last ounce of strength. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to let go. The canyon's walls gave way to a wider, flatter surface, and suddenly Elias found himself pulling onto the rim, breathless, shaking, soaking, but alive. He collapsed onto the flat stone, feeling the warmth of the sun touch his face for the first time in days. Every heartbeat echoed with the enormity of his escape. He lay still, allowing the world to steady itself around him. The flood raged far below, unseen but unmistakable in its echo. He had outclimbed the canyon, barely, but enough. He survived the canyon, but the true lesson wasn't escape. It was what the canyon taught in return.
Elias Mercer walked away from the canyon changed, not by its brutality, but by the precision of its lessons. Survival, he realized, wasn't a contest of force, it was a conversation between human perception and nature's patterns. Everything the canyon did carried meaning, and those who listened closely enough found direction in its rhythms rather than chaos. As he stepped onto level ground for the first time in days, Elias understood that what he carried with him now was more valuable than strength or supplies. He carried doctrine. The canyon behind him still rumbled with the fading echoes of the surge, as if reminding him of the systems he had learned to decipher. The pulses that rose every 12 to 18 minutes had once threatened to drown him, but they became signals that guided his timing. The turbulence spiraling 4 to 7 feet around submerged boulders offered clues that allowed him to interpret the unseen floor. Shelves carved 15 feet above the surge line had extended lifelines where none should have existed, while the hidden spine, no more than 2 to 4 feet wide, provided a secret ascent carved into the canyon's bones. Each feature had been part of a larger system working in harmony, and Elias had survived by becoming a student of those systems instead of resisting them blindly. Frontier life had always demanded respect for the environment, but the canyon refined that ethos into something more exact. Frontier travelers who survived the frontier did so not by overpowering the land, but by learning to recognize its patterns. The strongest weren't necessarily the ones who lived longest, it was the ones who learned quickest. Indigenous travelers understood this truth long before scouts walked these lands. Their knowledge was born from patient observation, and Elias now recognized how deeply his own survival had depended on wisdom shaped over generations. He entered the canyon with confidence in his skills, but he emerged with humility born of experience. Every shelf, current, and seam had played a role in his survival, and each one reinforced the same message: the land speaks, and those who survive are those who listen. As he walked along the rim, feeling sunlight soak slowly into his chilled skin, Elias replayed the lessons in his mind, not as scattered memories, but as principles carved into hard understanding. The canyon had distilled its teachings with a precision formed over centuries of seasonal floods and relentless erosion. He felt compelled to shape them into doctrine, not only to remember, but to honor what the canyon revealed when his life balanced on its edge. The first principle rose clearly: water speaks first, listen before moving. He remembered how the earliest signs of the surge came as faint rumbles and subtle sediment color. The water's behavior always preceded its force. Ignoring those signs could have trapped him before he even realized danger had returned. Next came the stone's lesson. Stone tells direction, reads seams, not faces. The canyon wall's smooth surfaces had misled him repeatedly, but the seams, thin, nearly invisible lines shaped by ancient fractures, revealed footholds he could trust. By reading those seams, he found roots others would never have seen. The third principle shaped itself from the cold that bit into him during every night he endured without fire. Cold is a thief. Manage it before hunger. His body had weakened long before hunger alone could explain it. The chill stole energy faster than time, draining his strength with quiet precision. Solving cold bought him clarity. Trying to power through it cost him far more than missed meals ever could.
Then he remembered the shelves and spines that saved him. Elevation is safety, but only if earned. Every rise in the canyon offered refuge from the rush of floodwater, but gaining that height demanded thoughtful planning. A 15-foot shelf had spared him from one surge, while the dry pocket inside the narrow crack had given him space to breathe. But those heights weren't gifts. He earned them through calculated climbs, steady movement, and respect for the rock beneath him. The fifth principle belonged to the canyon's rhythms. Patterns decide survival. Memorize them. Each pulse, each whirlpool, each shift of wind carried a pattern. The canyon never acted randomly. Elias survived by committing those rhythms to memory. Without remembering the 12 to 18-minute pulse gap or the slope angles that shaped water flow, he would have been swept away long before reaching safety. Finally, the lesson that tied them all together surfaced with undeniable clarity. Knowledge outlasts strength, every time. Strength had nearly failed him on the final ascent. Hunger and cold had stripped his muscles down, making each climb feel heavier than the last. But what kept him alive was knowing how to read the stone,
time the water and conserve energy. Knowledge, not physical power, became the force that carried him to the canyon rim. He paused at the edge of a boulder overlooking the basin below. The canyon looked smaller from this height, almost serene, as if hiding its capacity for violence. But Elias knew better. The measurements etched into his memory, 40-foot walls, 6-inch-per-minute rises, 8 to 12 mile-per-hour currents, reminded him of what had truly happened inside those narrow walls. The place wasn't merely dangerous, it was precise. Everything it did followed laws formed over centuries, and understanding those laws was the difference between survival and tragedy. He could see from this angle how the choke point shaped the current in ways that seemed unpredictable to an untrained traveler. He recognized where the stone spine climbed through the canyon's interior, invisible from the outside, yet critical to escape. Even the fractured ledge that nearly failed him now appeared as a small detail, a detail that almost shaped his fate. All of it belonged to the canyon's doctrine, an interlocking system of signs that rewarded those who studied it. The more he examined the landscape, the more he understood how many travelers might have wandered into the canyon unawares, misreading the signs or ignoring them entirely. The path he had taken offered clues to anyone willing to listen, yet countless others had likely missed them. The canyon wasn't cruel, it was consistent, but consistency could feel like cruelty to those who didn't understand it. Elias drew one final breath of the dry, sun-warmed air and turned away from the rim. His body was weak, his steps unsteady, but his mind carried clarity sharper than any blade he had ever held. He knew that he hadn't merely escaped a dangerous place. He had passed through a trial shaped by stone and water, and he emerged with a deeper respect for the land than he had ever known. The canyon spared him, but countless others misread its signs. This story reveals why he lived when so many didn't. Elias Mercer never looked back at the canyon without remembering how close he came to becoming one more silent name lost to its depths. He survived not by outrunning the flood, but by learning to read the land with the humility it demanded. In the end, the canyon didn't spare him out.